I'm Kelly, and I'm a PhD student in Claire Gillen's lab in Trinity College, Dublin, and I'm going to talk about understanding how bodily focus repetitive behaviours relate to habit learning. And so, as we've heard a lot today, bodily focus repetitive behaviours involve acts such as picking, pulling, and biting that cause harm to one's physical body, but also significant mental distress, and can impair a person's overall functioning. They're extremely common, affecting, I have 1 to 2%, but as we heard from Jude earlier, 5%. But rates of actually engaging in these behaviours can be as high as 10 to 20%. However, despite this huge significance, I think we know very little about what's going on under the hood and how these behaviours manifest. And so to get at this, some of our scientific theories have largely been based on this two systems approach, where behaviour is either controlled from the fast habit system, and this produces almost reflexive type behaviours that people form without much effort. So as soon as I get up, I can actually find myself reflexively scrolling on TikTok, actually without being consciously aware. Or behaviour can be controlled by our slower goal-directed system, and this produces goal-orientated behaviours that require a little bit of effort to perform. So at the moment when I get up, I will consciously just go make myself a little cup of tea in line with my goal of reducing my phone usage. And so a question that I wanted to ask in my PhD research is, well, what system controls bodily focus repetitive behaviours? And so far through my own and other people's work, we found that reductions in the goal-directed system have been associated with the spectrum of disorders related to compulsivity. So this reflects experiencing these tremendous urges to perform repetitive actions despite negative consequences. So for example, having to wash your hands over and over again, that actually causes skin lesions in OCD. But because of some of the evidence here that behaviours that reflect more reflexive forms, including tics, hair pulling, but also skin picking, that these share disturbances in chemicals in the brain that play a role in inhibiting behaviours, we thought that maybe bodily focus repetitive behaviours manifest through an overactive habit system. And while this is a lovely, neat distinction, I think, as Claire really nicely summed up earlier, in reality, it's a lot more complex than this. I also know that this doesn't map neatly onto everyone's experiences. So for example, not all bodily focused repetitive behaviours are reflexive. And for some, they can be extremely goal-driven, something that's been kind of highlighted throughout the day. And so what we think is that variations of repetitive behaviours likely all sit along this continuum from more motoric to compulsive behaviours, but how that behaviour manifests can carry some variation at the individual level. And so in the lab, we measure habits in a much more controlled process as habits in the wild. So we do this by getting participants to learn pairings between a symbol and a keyboard response. They then do this a lot, often for like several days, up to weeks. And then as the deceiving psychology researchers that we are, we then play a little trick on them. And we swap some of these responses that participants then have to relearn. We then observe in the test if participants perform that new or goal-directed response, acting in line with the goal of being correct, or the old response reflecting habit. So this unconscious bias to perform this well-trained, previously rewarding response. Again, though, we're very mean, and we actually make them do this under time pressure. So sometimes they have a lot, sometimes they have very little time to respond. And a key finding in the lab is that we observe habits under this time pressure, where it's thought that participants don't have time to recruit the slower but more accurate goal-directed processes, and we have to rely on our quick but sometimes kind of inaccurate habit system. However, though, in-lab methods are often inaccessible and burdensome for participants. So as I mentioned, these studies can take days to weeks of participants repeatedly coming into the lab, and this is really limiting our sample size and is also preventing us from testing these questions related to habit learning and clinical differences. And so a huge focus of mine, but also our labs, is to take a bit more of a smartphone approach. And this allows us to access bigger samples. Participants can take part from the comfort of their own homes, and it also makes repeated testing a lot easier. And so our lab has developed a free smartphone-based app called Eureka, and it contains many games, but the one I'm going to be focusing on today is CogQuest. And so CogQuest is a gamified version of the task that I just described to measure habits. So to give you a look at what our much more fun version looks like to play. So basically, over 7 days for a couple of minutes a day, we get participants to learn pairings between these falling cogs and button responses before we switch some of these. And so not shown here, but we also get people to report on aspects of their mental health, including bodily focus, repetitive behaviours, and others listed. Just like in the in-lab version, we then, in the test, we're interested in how people respond under varying time pressures. And so we actually do this by asking participants to respond when the zone turns green. And so as you can see here, the cog then either is presented either a short time or a long time before this flash. And so collection is ongoing, but we currently have data from over 581 people, and here are some of the characteristics. But because all of this is done online and without coming into the lab, we first need to make sure, well, does the game actually work? And so here, looking at the percentage of habits, comparing time versus no time pressure, we actually replicated the in-lab findings, observing these more habits during the time pressure when it suggested that we're under this habitual control. Next, we wanted to test if these motoric repetitive behaviors are distinct from compulsive. And so we do this using a method that takes all questionnaire item responses and it groups similar items together to find these overarching themes or factors of mental health versus the kind of independent diagnoses that the questionnaires are based on. And so this pretty rainbow graph does have some substance to it. So here, each bar represents a questionnaire item, and then all items from the same questionnaire are presented in one color. And then the height of the bar then reflects how much that item is associated with that factor. And so this factor here is comprised of items related to hair pulling, ticks, but also some skin picking items. And so this was really cool for me to see because it's very much like this motoric dimension that we had initially thought about. And so the next factor had a mixture of mainly OCD and some eating disorder in blue, but also impulsivity in green. Some other aspects also of anxiety, autism, and some skin picking. And this factor is very similar to the dimension of compulsivity that was previously identified in research. And so I was really excited to find this in the data because not all of my thoughts from my PhD have actually come to life like this. But also it's the first time that we've been able to identify this motoric dimension of mental health that's really underrepresented in my field of research anyway. And so just to note, I didn't have time to talk through the first factor, and it was an anxious depression one that was comprised of anxiety, apathy, and depression items. And so next we wanted to test, well, if the motoric or the compulsive repetitive behaviors are actually related to habit learning. And so what we did is we took the numbers of habits made and we correlated this with the motoric scores. And we actually found no association. And so this is evident by this kind of like straight dark red line, and each dot here represents a participant. And so we then repeated this using the compulsive scores. And surprisingly, we actually found a positive association. So the more compulsive you are, the more habits you made. Again, this was kind of super interesting because my own research has suggested that compulsive behaviors may manifest through a goal-directed system. And these brain systems, they're kind of assumed to be independent, but I think this is a nice piece of evidence that suggests that perhaps actually they interact too. And so there's still a little bit more data to collect on this, but so far we see that habit learning is associated with compulsive and not motoric repetitive behaviors. And so I probably shouldn't talk about takeaways just right before our little lunch break, but we found that bodily focused repetitive behaviors appear to map onto this motoric dimension of mental health that is distinct from repetitive behaviors related to compulsivity. However, though, these behaviors may not manifest through an overactive habit system as we initially thought. And so my next steps is to test if motoric dimension is associated with the goal-directed system, and we have a measure of this through another game in the app that I just didn't have time to speak to today. I'm also currently recruiting a clinical sample to see if these findings hold true in people with diagnoses of habit-related disorders. So if anyone is interested in getting involved in that research or our lab's smartphone research, definitely come to speak to me or sign up via our mailing lists. Lastly, I need to thank all the heavy lifters on this project, to Trinity Travel for funding my lovely trip here, but most importantly for the hosts and for you for listening.